statutes of limitations, but that's supposed to be a joke.
I got it.
So what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a quick overview of the BAT mission, our concept of operations, some of the assets that we had working with us, and at the end, I want to talk about the accomplishments, and I want to finish by naming people who were part of that operation. Well, you know, it's interesting today in the handout, it talks about it's Bahamas, Antilles, and Turks. Originally, it was Bahamas and Turks, and now if you read about it, if you Google it, it'll say Bahamas, Turks, and Caicos. It's all three the same mission. It's just it's expanded as the operation matured. But basically, it was about the two island groups that were off the coast of Florida and were a threat to us because they were used by the druggers to station and to move drugs from their location to here. And the Bahamas, 700 islands, over 200 cays or small little bays, hiding places all over the place. It's a third world country, had its population dispersed all around over about 100,000 square mile area. One of these islands, Bimini, was only 65 miles away from Miami. And if you had a really good cigarette boat, you could run that you could run it about 30 minutes from Bimini to Miami over the water. Smugglers use several types of ways to get the drugs into the United States. The two most known, of course, are by air, the other by boat. Air, we were very good at deterring them as far as getting in. Boats, a little bit less, but they used a combination of both. They would use pack the marijuana and cocaine, they'd put it on ships, and they would come in and they would slip in as fishermen, or they would use the cigarette boats. Again, they would drop the bales in the water, they'd pick them up, and then they'd haul buggy to the United States. OpBat was actually thought up by the DEA. It was by an officer who was there at the embassy. And bottom line is the effort was to cut the flow coming up from Colombia to the U.S. OpBat was not a standalone mission. It was part of the Vice President's Joint South Florida Drug Task Force, at that time Vice President Bush, but it was part of a larger policy issue that President Reagan had, which was the war on drugs. The overall coordinating agency for OpBat was the Coast Guard. The DEA directed OpBat down at our level. We also had support from Customs, State Department, Coast Guard, and of course Bahamian Agency. So it was kind of an interagency type task force that was doing this. DEA and the Air Force, we operated out of the embassy right there at Nassau. That was our op center. And we conducted joint planning and coordination and executing the mission. The Air Force mission as part of OpBat was pretty simple. Provide tactical mobility for Bahamian Police Strike Force. We would get a 5 or 6 man team on board. They carried M16s, handguns. They could carry weapons. We could not. Our DEA agent, who was also on our crew, could carry a weapon. The only people who didn't have the weapons were the people flying the aircraft. That's what they told me. I think if you would have checked helmet bags, you'd probably find out there was probably more weapons on that aircraft than you originally thought. So, I think we had more firepower than the SWAT team and the DEA agent. What do you think, 2T?
Yep.
Okay, and bottom line is we provided that mobility to move the team around where it needed to be. One thing we had to work through early before we even started the mission was posse comitatus. Everybody know what that is? We can't do that type of stuff that we were doing in the Bahamas, and we were flying around with a big white and black lettered sign that said police on either side. I guess you could also say it was kind of a shoot me sign if you were a bad guy. What it was ruled was is that posse comitatus did not apply outside the boundaries of the United States. However, the Secretary of Defense and the Attorney General had to sign an emergency declaration that there was a capability that only the military could provide so that we could actually go down there and do our mission. Now, we had some restrictions placed upon us that we had to adhere to. We couldn't make any arrests. We couldn't conduct any searches and seizures, and we weren't supposed to interdict any vessels or vehicles. I know we didn't make any arrests. Questionable whether or not we did any searches and seizures, and I can guarantee you we did some interdicting. So, and again, since we didn't have the law enforcement authority, our job was to move the DEA agent and the SWAT team around. They made the arrests. Now I want to kind of give you a concept of how the whole thing operated. And it was kind of a layered defense. We had radars, FAA radars, out of Gitmo, Cuba. That was called Almighty. Andros Island, which was the biggest island in the chain, that was called Rampart, and we had another one in Miami called Slingshot. And basically, they were looking for a profile. A plane would take off out of Colombia, and it would land in Jamaica to get gas, and then it would come up through the Windward Passage to stay away from Cuba, and then it would then that's where the radars would start looking. They were looking for a low, slow type profile, no flight plan, and then they would usually launch a customs aircraft who could fly in the Bahamian airspace but couldn't land. And then they would come up and intercept in a way so they were above and behind, and they could look and say, well, there's two guys flying, there's no back seats, or the back windows are obscured so I can't see. So then what they would do is they take the tail number and they would call it into EPIC, which is the El Paso Information Center, and it's just a big database of anything. We use that all the time. We'd see a boat, we give it the boat number, call EPIC, and they say it's stolen or it's been known for this or that, and then we would act on it. Well, if any of those scenarios kind of played out, or both of them at the same time, then the customs bird would call to the embassy, and then that's when OpBat would get into motion. And then we would actually send DEA birds. They had a couple birds, they were there, a couple twin engine aircraft. And then that's when we would get the strike team, the DEA agent, and the air crew, and then we would start launching. And the whole idea is trying to get to where they're going to be, to land, not to interdict, to land and stop them or catch them in the process of doing that. Now, that was a pretty good system, but it had some flaws. Those FAA radars were old, so it took a lot of maintenance. They didn't have a lot of qualified people to run them. So, like a good cop on his beat, we sat down with the DEA folks, say, hey, there's a better way of doing this. And this was guys like Don Nieto and Smokey Hubbard, smart tacticians, and we started working the area like a cop would work his beat. And so we started running patrols, not just the inner islands, but the outer islands. Everybody likes flying during the day, but we love flying at night. 20th was one of the first units, if not the first unit in the Air Force, to start flying NVGs in the late 70s. So by the time 83 came along, NVGs were very comfortable with the crews. We started infilling crews, SWAT teams, at known little areas. They were very smart. They had these little dirt runways, and you come in and you land, they kick the stuff out left and right, and there was a little keyhole at the end. They just turn around and fly back off. So within literally 2 minutes, 3 minutes, they could land, drop their stuff, and get back off. So if you weren't there, you weren't going to get it. So we started staking stuff out. We started using confidential informants. We also started doing things like flying around and burning their little operational huts and coconuts from 1,000 feet into boats. Do great damage. I think that was Grant Hart. It was not Jack Hester. He's not here to defend himself either, I don't think. Okay, so that's how that kind of happened, and then how we tasked organized for it. The Air Force told the first SAL to go skinny. What does that mean? Use minimum force required at minimum expense to meet tasking. So what we did was we tailored our force. We sent 2 M models down there. We had 18 personnel. Op Center was out of Nassau, and the We launched out of the police academy right there. They had a big tarmac area. You could put 2 Hueys in there easily, and that's where our everyday maintenance was at. We also had maintenance over at Andros Island. The Navy had a facility over there, and that's where we could do a little bit more heavy maintenance. We also had, the DEA had 2 agents that were permanently stationed there at the embassy, and they always had 3 guys who were TDY to support the planning and the missions. We talked about the DEA had some aircraft. They had 2 light twins. They had a King Air and an Aerostar. And we also made some modifications to our helos to make it easier for the crews to do their mission. We put a radar altimeter on them, which helped at night, especially over when you're flying over the land, not so much over water. HF radio that gave us kind of long-range contact with a lot of different agencies that were out there flying around. I used to talk to E2Cs all the time that were flying out of Gitmo, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, that was a nice voice to hear that there's somebody out there that had you on the radar, something happened to you. And we also got what we thought was the greatest gift from God ever, which was the Omega navigation system. It was a VLF navigation system the Navy actually uses on their submarines, but it was a very simple navigation system that we could use to navigate over water. It made it a lot more precise when we took off and we were immediately over water and we had to go VFR direct somewhere because we had to get there right now. Okay, so that's all builds us up to actually doing some missions. And we actually started on 3 May, and I found some of the stuff that I got from Rich Sertliff and from the AFSOC historians, great information I got. I found some, it looked like a press clipping that they might have released if they could, or if they wanted to. But it said, the first cell commenced the operation on 3 May, and by the end of the month had logged quite a take. On the first day, air crews in the UH-1N helicopters assisted in the capture of a Cessna 210 aircraft with 26 duffel bags full of cocaine. The next day, they helped in the seizure of a 20-foot boat with 40 bales of marijuana aboard. On 4 July, American Independence Day, Operation Bat celebrated by capturing a Cessna carrying 863 pounds of cocaine and a 70-foot mothership carrying 30 tons of marijuana. By August 4th, Operation Bat had resulted in the confiscation of 1,243 pounds of cocaine, and that goes for, back then it went for a street value of $15,000 a kilo, and 83,460 pounds of marijuana that went for $600 a pound back then. In addition to this, 100 bales of marijuana and 26 packages of cocaine had been jettisoned at sea, 9,000 pounds of marijuana had burned up, and 2 aircraft crashes. And it ends up by saying the cost of drug trafficking had gone up. And it had, but only for a while. You got to understand that we were fighting the cartels. And despite all the assets that the U.S. government had in fighting the war on drugs, probably didn't spend as much money and probably didn't have the infrastructure or the desire and will that the cartels did to make money. And as long as there was going to be a need here, there was going to be a resource coming in. So we won a lot of tactical victories, a couple operationally, but as we're still kind of fighting the war on drugs today, I would say that from a strategic standpoint, we're still trying to get there. The 20th flew OPBAT till September of 1985, and I know that because I was downrange flying the last missions. But in August of that year, it started the transfer from the 20th to the 48th Rescue Squadron, which was down at Homestead, and they stood up specifically for that. And the 48th was almost the 20th south, because the maintenance and a lot of the pilots that were there had come from the 20th. So, and then eventually, in October of 1987, 23rd Air Force was just overtasked, and the Coast Guard was probably better fit overall when you looked at the whole picture of not only interdicting, but the legal side and everything else of taking over the mission completely. And in fact, they're still doing OPBAT today. You can go to the American Embassy website in Nassau, and you can get information. So let me finish up by reading one more thing I found that from the historian office at AFSOC. It talked about 30 September 1987, the 23rd Air Force terminated its participation in Operation Bahamas and Turks. The U.S. Air Force contribution to Operation began as a temporary assignment on 1 May 83. Initially, 2 UH-1 helicopters and 18 personnel of 20th Special Operations Squadron, 23rd Air Force, were stationed at Nassau. They worked closely with the Bahamian police, personnel of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, and personnel of the U.S. Coast Guard. One temporary extension followed another, and several years passed. The 20th SOS requested relief, and other 23rd Air Force units and detachments, notably the 40th Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Squadron, sent air crews and aircraft on temporary duty for BAT. Eventually, the 48th AARS assumed the BAT duties upon its activation at Homestead Air Force Base, Florida, on 1 August 1985. Between 1 May 1983 and 30 September 1987, the record of U.S. Air Force in Operation BAT was impressive. We flew 4,726 hours. We flew 4,090 sorties. We did 45 island sweeps, 162 infiltration missions, 937 patrols, 37 response to aircraft crashes. We tracked over 107 aircraft. We helped in 293 individuals being arrested by the Bahamians. We had 23,175 pounds of cocaine was seized. 314,327 pounds of marijuana was seized. 42 drug vessels. 61 aircraft were seized. 17 aircraft crashed because of our efforts. We seized 15 drug vehicles and over 23 drug weapons. Monetarily, these figures translate to $157,163,000 of cocaine using a wholesale price of $15,000 per kilo, and $188,596,200 of marijuana using a wholesale price of $600 per pound. The estimated street value of this contraband is estimated to exceed $1 billion and has been put as high as $3 billion. Moderate estimate by most puts the number at about $1.5 billion. So that's the mission. That's how we did it. It's kind of the results of what we had. And then the last thing I want to do is kind of just do a roll call on names that I remembered who flew the mission. And I know there's guys out here who I forgot. So when I get done, I'm going to ask if you flew, stand up and be recognized. First was Smokey Hubbard, Don Nieto, Ron Marriott, Sam McNair, Lloyd Bufink, Don Hoover, Jim Mahegan, Jim Schaefer, Dennis Jones, Grant Harden, Rocky Burns, Paul Boland, Roger Smith, Dale Alexander, Scott Cummings, Carl Nagel. Our back enders. Again, this is just guys I remember, and there's plenty more. Keith Moore, Les Beecher, Buck Watson, Nelson Neal, J.D. Smith, Barry Aswell, Glenn Wortland, Mike Barton, Dickie Mustard, Bobby Jenkins. Oh, I got to talk about Dickie Mustard. We had some people convinced, Jim Schaefer and I had people convinced at the embassy that he was our dad. That was a good story. Well, and Dickie looked old enough to be our dad. Bobby Jenkins, Dale Blackwood, and Paul Carter. Maintenance guys, I had Ron Enberg, Bruce Davis, who I know 2T's going to talk about him, but
Go ahead.
Everything that's happening here today is because a maintainer wasn't going to let one of his aircraft and his aircrew be unnoticed. And if it wasn't the bulldoggedness of Bruce Davis, I don't know if this would be happening today. So remember that today, please, when you go home. But there's Chris Lenahan, Bob Strong, and Pat Tenney. Now, I know Ron Enberg, you're in there. Ron, anybody else that you can identify?
Jay Headley, Matt Matthews, and Glenn Hamamura, call him Hama.
Yeah.
That's just a few. That's what I can remember.
Are any other pilots, FEs, gunners, stand up and call out? Herb Herb, how you doing, brother?
Bill Williams.
Bill Williams.
2AD
There you go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. Oh, got one more. John? Rick? That was it. That was, I tell you what, it was a great time as a young lieutenant to be flying around doing a real world mission. And although we were only doing training, explain the bullet hole in the aircraft. It was a training round. So thank you for your time, and thank you for coming out to remember my good friends. And I look forward to talking to you afterwards if you have any more questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah. It's already going. You just let it go.
Need any help? You need some help?
Thank you, Colonel Hester. Our second guest speaker for today is Technical Sergeant Retired Paul Carter. Sergeant Carter, more commonly referred to as 2T by close friends and squadron members, enlisted in the Air Force in 1972 as a weapons specialist. After 2 tours at Nellis Air Force Base and Thailand, Sergeant Carter came to Hurlburt Field and the 20th Special Operation as a gunner in the UH-1N helicopters. There, he earned 2 Air Force Accommodation Medals for his work on the Squadron Patch and other squadron projects. When 44 Alpha crashed into the sea near the Bahamas in January of 1984, Sergeant Carter was the only military member to survive the crash and received the Air Medal for his sacrifice in that mission. In November of the same year, he was medically retired from the Air Force and began a career training service dogs for search and rescue missions for the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The highlight of this career came in 2002 when one of his bloodhounds, Ginger, was integral in finding